Well, Matrix was interesting because it came out of almost a joke. When Trump was elected in 2016, my friends and I had this joke about how we wanted to just live on an island of women without any men at all. Because there's this like toxic masculinity just like permeating out of, the presidency into the rest of society. And then I thought, well, wouldn't it be fun and wonderful if I were to write a book where men existed in the way that women have existed in literature in the past, as sort of flitting shadows along the wall, not at the center. And so in Matrix, in the English version, there are no male anythings. Not even the animals are male whatsoever. And there are no individual men. So they're seen as sort of like a lump in the distance, but not, in the present tense. And I found that fun, right? I mean, it was just fun. And that allowed me to think about issues of power and particularly ambition when it comes to women and the way that, power structures replicate themselves if we're not careful. It's not a hagiography in any way, this book, but it is really, I really wanted to think about bringing Marie de France, who was a real person, the first published female poet in the French language, about whom we know nothing other than her name was Marie and she was from France, and sort of making her into an actual figure predicated on other abbesses of the time, like Hildegard von Bingen and, Julian of Norwich, all of the female mystics, and creating a space where I can talk about the way that the church was vastly misogynistic in the past, and how a lot of the mental structures actually have led to where we are now in the 21st century. Some of the things that I'm thinking through in this whole project, so Matrix and The Vaster Wilds are two parts of a triptych that sort of spans 1,000 years. And they're written very differently, right? I'm not calling it a trilogy because they're just different in every possible way. And sort of the central concern, but a lot of the thematic issues are the same or very similar, and they're sort of floating around ideas of the female body, religion as it sort of imposes itself as a cage upon the female body, and the way that religion manifests itself in our attitudes toward nature, which is the same as our attitudes toward the female body, right? So all three books sort of deal with the same thematic concerns. The third one I'm still working on, and if it doesn't work out, it'll be a diptych, right? So it'll just be 2 books. I'm really interested in sort of subverting the common narrative of the hero. I hate the hero story. It is the only thing we're given in popular culture. Every movie is a superhero movie, right? Where there's a single person who is exceptional, and that exceptional person is better than everyone else, and right? And will save the world, whatever. But I think that is so fundamentally tragic for humanity, actually, to have faith in a single person, and it's very fundamentally misogynistic as well. Because the reality is history is made by a texture of humans. It's not made by an individual, right? History is made by the people who are forgotten to history, by the people who get up every day and make bread and, make the earthenware bowls out of which one eats one's food. And to ignore that is to ignore the great democracy of history. It's to sort of single out the individual. So one of my projects is to sort of breathe life back into the kind of person whom history has forgotten, right? The beautiful thing is one can use the archive to write back into history, to sort of to use fiction to sort of fill the spaces that have been left vacant through the lack of interest by historians who have been predominantly male in the past. And one can actually rebuild or reconstruct an idea of what the past might have been that is forgotten. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to do is pay attention to the people who have been forgotten. Even though Marie de France was a real person, the fact that even though she put out literature that is enduring. We still read The Lay of Marie de France, but nobody cared to even question who she was, right? Who her family was, where she came from. Nobody knows any of this or what she did with her life. We just have these suppositions that she was an abbess. So rebuilding a life, which is in fiction, so it's, not necessarily true, but it is gesturing in the direction of verisimilitude, is a way to sort of refill the gaps in the historical record. Yeah, so each of the novels, all of my work has a very different form, and it's something that is built in iteration. I write a draft, put it aside, think about it, and then start over and do it over and over again. And so with Matrix, I really drew on a lot of medieval literature, right? So I drew on The Lay of Marie de France, and I drew on a lot of the courtly romances of the time, and a lot of the narratives of the English and French martyrs, female martyrs and female mystics, in order to sort of build a mode of telling the story that does have in some ways, you can read Matrix as a rosary, right? So it's event after event after event, and you're sort of praying into a life in a very real way. Someone did make a joke with me that I carried around for years, and they said, the standard structure of a piece of drama, the Aristotelian structure, is in the form of a male orgasm. And in some ways, I was trying to write Matrix in the form of a female orgasm, so it's a little bit more like a jellyfish through the. And then with the Vaster Wilds, I was drawing on Elizabethan texts. I went back to Shakespeare, and I went back to all of the narratives that were told of Jamestown in 1610, and I sort of built a more, just a different sort of formal structure for this book as well. I think each project requires its own form, and the story itself demands the form, and usually when my drafts don't succeed, it's because I haven't figured out what that form is. So in Matrix, the thing that I was so dazzled by when I was studying medieval mystics is that, say Hildegard von Bingen, who is one of my favorite humans in all of history, she took the abstract, right? So she took the voice of God and turned it into concrete material good. So she's able to take the voice of God, broadcast it to the world, and through that gets money and influence to build her own abbey to protect her daughters, right? Which is, for me, I think that's actually the definition of genius, is to take the abstract and make it concrete. The visions in Matrix were very much a way of creating power, right? Or creating symbolism, creating a mode of talking about material advancement. And in the Vaster Wilds, honestly, for a few early drafts, there weren't any visions or anything. It was just a girl in nature, and she was so lonely. She was just a solitary figure in a really harsh landscape. And I realized that even if she's alone, she doesn't have to be lonely, right? She can be haunted by her ghosts. She can be haunted by the voice of God. She can be haunted by her memories. And so all of these things together build a world that is less uninhabited, right? It's inhabited, even if it's inhabited by projection and hologram. So they have different functions, but it's true that, I think the world is teeming with invisible powers, and I think it's foolish to deny that that's the case. And so I like to acknowledge the invisible powers. The divine, the material, and the metaphysical, it's all interconnected, right? You cannot divide it. I think we come to problems when we try to divide the worlds. And in fact, I think a lot of the problems we've been having with the last 50 years is that we've been siloing ourselves into these solely scientific, right? especially in literature. And I think we've created an almost secular, entirely secular literature. And I too have problems with organized religion, but I don't like the idea of turning our backs on sort of the grand and eternal mysteries, which I think that a lot of literature has been doing by hyper-focusing on humans and human supremacy. We've been ignoring the rest of the world and the things that we can't see and are connected to through our ancestors and through the people who've lived before us. And I know that sounds really quite metaphysical, right? But I think one of the urgencies of literature is addressing the really profound, deep, shared, and universal human truths. And I think in every culture, every single one, all over the world, there has been a yearning toward the comprehension or the meeting of the larger questions, right? And whether you call that God, whether you call that, metaphysics, whether you call that, I don't even know. It's still sort of a universal human urge, which it makes me sad to see literature impoverishing itself by turning its back on. So I actually find it an urgency, that especially in the Anthropocene, especially up against the brink of possible permanent collapse in humanity, to deny this really profound and atavistic response to the world seems foolish to me. I've been thinking really deeply about organized religion and the way that organized religion structurally is set up in order to alienate humanity from nature. And I think, it comes out of fear, I think, and it comes out of Genesis, this idea that, God came down and handed Adam dominion over the beasts of the field and of the waters and of the sky. But of course, we have misread dominion into domination, right? So into superiority. And I think one of the things that I was really inspired by Richard Powers' incredible book, The Overstory, was this collapsing of the hierarchy in which humanity is at the very tip of the pyramid, speaking into the ear of God. Through his sort of focusing on trees, the pyramid collapsed, and there's this pulling up of the rest of life into a position of equality. And that is something that I think is a really urgent narrative, and it goes against all knee-jerk forms of storytelling where because of the supremacy of humanity and humans' imagination, it's really hard to see everything else as equal, right? The whale in the sea as equal, the jellyfish, the bear, whatever. But I do think it's at this moment, at the cusp of species collapse, if we don't change the narrative of human supremacy, we're in profound trouble. And we do it by collapsing these narratives that are so old and so ingrained, and we undermine that sort of this feeling that humans are at the top of the pyramid. And so that's, honestly, it's really subtle in Matrix. It's much more overt in The Vaster Wilds as the girl's going through nature. A lot of her just, cultural civilization prejudices fall away from her, and she does start feeling at one with nature. And even though nature is both indifferent to her plight because she is just an animal among animals, it's also a place where she gets nourishment, right? So it's both giver and taker. And she starts to respect it and not feel herself as above it. And I think this is the narrative that I hope more literature starts to engage in, because if we don't change this idea of ourselves being at the very top, we're in so much trouble. We will never recover the planet. As we move as humans through our days and years and lives, I think we often have these moments of revelation, and I would call them moments of ecstasy or moments of revelation, moments when all of the quotidian falls away from us and we do see clearly for a brief moment, right? And those of us who are more evolved or more spiritually attuned to the world have these moments last much longer. I have them very briefly. But I think they're incredibly important and they're part of being a human. And I think it's one of these shared experiences that most people can actually sort of point to, these moments where suddenly, briefly, everything comes into focus, right? And you don't have to have a spiritually ecstatic moment in order to experience these, right? It doesn't have to be in church. It doesn't have to be, doing ayahuasca, right? It doesn't have to be having run 36 miles and you're so exhausted and suddenly everything falls away. It doesn't have to be in the flow of creation, right? But all of these things are ways toward sort of losing the ego and starting to see the divine pattern, which does exist, right? And Elon Musk and techno-optimists would say that it's, the computers in the sky that are sort of making all of us work, and religious people would say it's God, whatever God means. I just think there is an intricate geometry underlying everything. And it's a very profound human desire to sort of try to understand it or try to reach it or touch it, right? That's where the impulse to make art comes from, is the impulse to, it's almost wordless, anti-verbal, to connect to something deeper and more beautiful, and that is always there under the surface. To be a channel for that, not only for yourself, but for other people. So I think that's actually the most beautiful part of humanity, is sort of yearning toward this golden geometry. I think every novel requires texture, and texture comes in many different ways. Right? It comes in the form of the writing and sort of the humor or lack of humor that comes in and out, the seriousness and the elevation of tone, all of these things. But it also can come in these brief, sharp moments followed by these long descriptions, right? So if you look at the great works of literature, it's nothing is ever one thing, right? It's always texture after texture, and there's sometimes a very overt pattern, and sometimes it's more within the bones and the DNA of the work. It's all about developing an ear, and trying, as you're writing and rewriting and rewriting, trying to discover the places where it's been too long before you have a moments of clarity and revelation. Also in life, let's be perfectly honest, right? If your days have been gray and blending in together for months and months at a time, you're ready to have a shocking moment, so it's sort of a bracing jump into the cold water of ecstasy, right? I do think we have a moral obligation to see joy and to see sunlight and to see beauty. I do. I think, and it's not just in nature, right? It's in other people. I think if often, and I can only speak for myself, because I don't inhabit any other human. But when I cannot see these things, when I'm sunk in ego, I'm often unable to sort of recognize what a profound gift and miracle it is that our progenitors, through thousands of generations, were able to actually have babies that ended up creating a successful you, right? I mean, that, if you just think about that, that is such a wild, almost 0% chance of you being in the world, right? Us being in the world. And so sometimes when I forget to stop and sort of step out of my own, self, I do feel as though I'm turning my back on the better parts of being alive, on life itself in some ways. And I do think it is immoral. The set of her mind then became soft and infinitely open, and as she gazed down into the water, she saw in the depths below her, playing in and out of the boat's shadow, a swift gray fish that might have been a porpoise like the ones that had danced around the ship's wake as they rowed across the face of the ocean. And now it came near, and there was something in the shining glimpse, the liquid black eye of the fish gazing up at her as it passed out of the shadow and into the light that made her say yes aloud and gasp. There was an element in the trembling intensity of this vision, so unlike the other most dazzling moments of her life that, for a breath, it pierced the little cloud of dullness in which she normally moved through her days. And it seemed to her that she could almost see something now moving beneath the everyday, the daily, the gray and oppressive stuff of the self, something more like an intricate geometry that lived beneath the surface of the material world.